I'm Monica Olson.
And I'm Jennifer Walsh.
And you're listening to the Biophilic Solutions podcast, where every other week we sit down with experts and thought leaders across industries in order to explore the innate connection between humans and nature and why we need nature to thrive.
We truly believe that in order to tackle the global environmental problems we're facing, we as humans must reconnect to the natural world and come to a better understanding of how we fit in and how we are so interconnected. So in every episode, we'll interview new guests that help us uncover and highlight nature-based solutions to get us on a path to greater health, tackling climate change, and ultimately getting outside and connecting with nature.
So let's get to today's episode. Hey, Jennifer.
Hey, Monica.
Jen. You know what biophilia literally translates to, right? It's a love of nature. But have you ever considered the complete opposite of that, biophobia?
Okay, well, what's really funny is I can honestly say that I've never really stopped to think about biophobia before. I think part of that has to do with my fact that I'm really personally immersed in biophilia, and so much of my work has to do with bringing people into nature. It's almost a disconnection for me.
Yeah, no, it's funny. I feel the same way. I spend so much time thinking about the love of nature and the benefits of it. Like we have so many of those conversations that the fear of nature just seems foreign to me.
Absolutely. Well, luckily today, our guest wrote an article about this very topic called Beware, Creeping Biophobia, which was widely published in outlets like The Atlantic, Haikai, and Tyee. It is based on a Japanese study, which was found that as the world is rapidly urbanizing, fewer people are connecting to the natural world, especially in early age. And it then perpetuates a really negative cycle where disconnection ultimately leads to an outright fear.
And what do we do with the things that we fear, Jen? We either avoid them, right? Completely avoid them outright, or we stigmatize them. So our guest today is Emily Harwitz. She's a science journalist whose work revolves around celebrating the beauty of the outdoors, as well as fostering the sense of community and curiosity around it. We met Emily this past spring when she traveled to Serenbe. She covered the Biophilic Leadership Summit, and we're super excited to reconnect with her for this conversation.
Yes, I so love meeting her there. Okay, on a side note also, I just realized we're releasing this episode right before Halloween, which I feel like it fits just perfectly.
Yeah, we didn't plan it, but it definitely feels appropriate, right? All the scaries, right?
All the scaries. Okay, so in this interview, we chat with Emily about the vicious cycle of biophobia, how we can convert the biophobic to the biophilic, and we also dive into the reasons why humans are drawn to the collecting of rare species.
All right, well, let's get to our interview with Emily Harwitz.
Emily, we are so excited to have you on the podcast and to see you again. Welcome back to our world, but especially welcome to Biophilic Solutions.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to talk to you both here today.
We are thrilled to have you, Emily. We've been talking about you for quite some time, about your conversations that we had at the Biophilic Leadership Summit, and have lots of questions about, wow, we really need to dive in deeper with you. So what we always like to ask everybody on the podcast is give us a little bit about your background and how you got interested in biophilia, but also we'll dive into biophobia, which is going to be fascinating. So give us a little bit about your background, if you don't mind.
From an early age, I knew that I loved nature and I was really interested in the natural world. When I went to college for my bachelor's degree, I studied chemistry, which was really fascinating. And that's another thing that I love learning about is just like how the world is put together. But then I took a semester to go to Costa Rica where I studied tropical ecology and conservation. And that's something that, had been a passion of mine since I was little. I just didn't know how I could do it as a career, like how I could have a nature-based career, like being able to share my love for nature. Yeah, I just didn't know what kind of careers were open for me. But when I did that semester in Costa Rica, that really solidified my desire to do something in the environmental space. So that was really cool. And then for a little bit, I was working in sustainability, and then I worked for an environmental conservation nonprofit. And then I just happened to meet someone who had done the science communication master's program at UC Santa Cruz. And we were talking about it. And, she was freelancing for Nat Geo, which is one of my big inspirations. I think that's very common for a lot of people that I talk to in this space. Just seeing the photos on the magazine and thinking about being out there and adventure and naturing and just experiencing these really powerful and compelling stories through the pages of the magazine. That's something that I actually, since I was little, I said being a photojournalist or writer for like something like Nat Geo is what I wanted to do, but I just had no idea how to do it. Until I met this person who did the program who said, well, you want to do it, here's how. And got into the program and here I am now doing it.
No, I love it.
Funny how that paths kind of take us in different places that we're not expecting, but these doors open, I always feel like, for reasons that, of course, we never really realized till later on, like why you were there, why you got introduced to this person. And that door was open for you to kind of discover the new world in front of you.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm glad that I took some time to eventually get to that program because I had experience working, in public lands and in conservation. So now with the work that I'm doing, what I really love to do is to tell stories about humans, our place in nature, and to help try to build that bridge to connect people with nature. It's not humans outside of nature. It's like, well, we're part of nature. And so how can we be part of this ecosystem?
Mm-hmm. You've written you've written a ton of stuff, but two bigger pieces that sort of really struck us. And the one that came into our world was a piece that you wrote called Beware Creeping Biophobia. And you wrote it for, and am I going to say it right? Haikai magazine. Am I saying that right?
Haikai.
Okay. But it was published in the Atlantic and also the Tyee. And so tell me a little bit about like how you thought about biophobia, and had you been studying biophilia, or were you just really concerned about people's sort of fear of nature?
Yeah, that piece made the rounds, and I'm really glad because it describes pernicious thing that appears to be happening, especially in rapidly urbanizing areas, places with more dense urban population. So biophobia is the fear of nature. It's the opposite of biophilia. In this article, we describe the cycle, the negative cycle of biophobia, where someone lacks the information or the experience with nature. And because of that, they don't go and seek it out. And that creates a further gap of information and experience. And that ignorance can lead to fear, but it perpetuates in this negative cycle where the more someone fears nature, the less they go out into and the less they want to know more about it. And so it can eventually even lead to things like people supporting policies that are not nature friendly. So I've been familiar with the term biophilia for some years now. Back when I was working in sustainability world, it was a topic of conversation. So I have always been a fan for all the reasons that you present here on this podcast. And this was the first time I'd heard about biophobia, the opposite of that. And when I was talking to the ecologist who wrote the study that the article is based on, he made an interesting point that there's a lot of studies about biophilia. The people who study it love nature, usually. But because of that, because of their love for nature, there is less attention on the opposite, on the fear of nature. So I thought this was a really interesting look on the other side of that. And where is the gap, and how does people's fear of nature begin? Sometimes, someone might not qualify it as a fear of nature. They might just say, oh, I don't care that much about it. I'm not that interested in nature. And, through this negative cycle, like it can perpetuate into that. It can build and build until they feel like, oh, I'm just not a nature person. And that, like, as I mentioned earlier, they can be either directly supporting policies or maybe just not even voting for the ones that would protect public green spaces or public access.
Not only does it harm a person's well-being by not having that connection, to your point, like policies can be problematic. People don't support nature-based policies, or they start exterminating nature. They don't understand what it does. Even, let's just say, people trying to get rid of, we're just heading out of summer here in Atlanta, mosquitoes, right? Nobody likes a mosquito, right? But if you spray for mosquitoes, then you're actually killing all of the ladybugs and the bees and the good bugs as well. And so thinking about what are other nature-based solutions for mosquitoes, whether that's a natural citronella type thing or putting up bat boxes, or like we have I think they're like little barn swallows that sit in our porch, and they eat like, I don't know, I'm making this up, 10 times their weight every night in mosquitoes or something. But you're like, if we educate, then how can we figure out not only to bring people into the concept? And so I love that you picked it up and wrote a very accessible article on it, because that's the thing, right? The first step is education.
Can I add to that, Monica? Because so like when I read your story, Emily, it like struck a chord with me because I never thought about biophobia before your article. And here I am so deeply connected to biophilia, but biophobia is so present in my everyday because living in New York City, I hear it all the time from women of all ages, especially not just men and women, but just women. A lot of them are like, oh, I'm not the outdoorsy kind of girl. Oh, I'm not a nature girl. I always put these things on silos that you're not an outdoors person. You're not a nature person. Oh, I don't like the outside. And I hear it all the time. So like that key point that you're talking about, you just said too, Monica, you touched on, is information and education is so critical. So that's why I thought this article was so poignant right now I'm so glad it got the legs that it did, received the legs that it did to really kind of bring awareness to saying, it's just kind of putting like a blind eye, like, oh, I'm separate from I don't like it. As I'm sitting here in my tent, the ocean breeze outside, I try and tread lightly when I talk to people about biophobia because of your article, or like, how do we then bring people into our world to make it accessible and understandable and digestible? Be like, oh, well, I didn't realize I needed it. I didn't know it was a part of me. So it's also an exciting time because we all get to educate people on why it matters. That's the biggest part.
Those are all such great points. Also, mosquitoes, something that not a lot of people know is that mosquitoes are really important pollinators. If you see those tiny, cute little flowers, male mosquitoes only drink nectar. They don't drink blood. So the male mosquitoes are really important pollinators. And like you said, mosquitoes are very important food sources for all sorts of animals. So it's my little mosquito tangent.
I love it.
Speaking of biophobia, growing up in Miami especially, I used to hate mosquitoes. I don't kill bugs, but they're the one bug that I would, squish.
But then I've got my zapper right here for my mosquitoes. Speaking of which, I mean this right here. So
yeah. But then when it was actually in that program in Costa Rica, like deep in the jungle, learning about mosquitoes and what they actually do for the ecosystem, I began to appreciate them. And they're like dangly and they're like cute in their own way. I still don't love them, but I appreciate them from a distance now.
The fear-based, right? Because the cycle, right, is disconnection, right? So we've sort of talked about that. Whatever it is, I'm living in the city and I don't know how to access it. Or I'm with you, Jen. The person who says, oh, I'm not an outdoorsy person. It's like, you want to dig in, like, what does it mean?
Yeah.
Because I might even say like, oh, I'm not really a camper, but like, have you been glamping? It's pretty fabulous. So it's like, what's the continuum that we're on? But then the information. And so if we don't have the education, right, that you have ignorance, right? And part of that, just to stay on our mosquitoes here, Emily, is, these sensationalist stories, which not to say they're not happening, but right, mosquitoes do spread certain diseases and definitely in some areas, very, very dangerous diseases. And so there are ways to either combat it or eradicate them. But some of it is, the media today can be very over the top, spreading even misinformation. So I think that probably adds to the societal level of people not interacting as much.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And the media is, the news media and also just media in general, like books, movies, TV.
Social media.
Really important players in either spreading misinformation and perpetuating this stuff that can lead to fear, or sharing information, like positive, accurate information. And to both of your points, Monica and Jen, about people who say, I'm not outdoorsy, I'm not a nature girl. There are so many different ways to connect with nature and to be outside. Actually, the podcast that I host is called I'll Go If You Go, and it's all about people from all walks of life and different ways to show up outside and to like have a relationship with nature that doesn't necessarily look like, your typical person in a puffer jacket and all their expensive hiking gear. Sure, that's one way to be outside, but you can also just show up in your, like, my typical hiking outfit is like jeans and Doc Marten boots, Yeah. So I think media and representation of even different ways to if it's visual media, like different ways to look when you're outside. It's really important. So people actually feel welcome going into outdoor spaces.
Oh, I'm so glad you said that, Emily. That's so true. Because again, it's spawning that whole like social media, like you have to look a certain way and you have to go to Yosemite or the Grand Canyon where, like you say, Emily and Monica and myself, we all share the same thing is you don't have to go far, just go. Like just go outside your door and just be present and witness the beauty that might be your front yard or your backyard or your street or whatever it might be. If there are trees on your tree-lined street, just to kind of, nature is for everybody. And it's so important that we kind of get that message out there. So that why we don't perpetuate that biophobia that is so pervasive in certain communities. And I know that too, coming from the Bronx, like I knew a lot of people that didn't have access because they weren't going to botanical gardens or the Bronx Zoo or Central Park. But I had parents that took me. So it's like these little things, these micro moments of people that are in our lives to help us nudge us outdoors are so important.
That's actually what the most recent season of the podcast that I host is about building community outdoors. You want to experience nature and you want to be outside, but you don't know how. Well, there are so many groups that anyone can join. You can just do a Google search and find groups in your area, or you can go on social media. That's a big way that a lot of people have been organizing, especially more like grassroots, non-official ways to and be with other people outside. And that's another reason why, like in early exposure that's a way to help kids feel safe in nature is to go with someone that they trust, a caregiver, or maybe it's an older friend or older sibling, but a person who can help create that safe space for the kids or even for adults to just go outside and know, okay, I'm safe here and now I can explore.
Yeah, I wonder if you're seeing in your work, this is just my mind's going in different directions here because I think it's fascinating. Like, how young can we get? If you go to a school that's not an outdoor school, they don't have a lot of outdoor programs. I'm just thinking there's a high school in Newark, New Jersey called St. Benedict's Prep. And I love it because it's in an inner city school. But every year they take, I believe it's a freshman, and they take them hiking. So all these kids are out hiking for like a week together to learn how to become a team, leadership, and so on. But they do it outdoors. And it's really scary for these kids because, again, they're not spending time outdoors. So for some of them, they're more scared of the outdoors than they are of like gunshots. But St. Benedict's Preps has been doing this for years and years and years, getting these kids outdoors first before they come together in the classroom, which I think is so profound. So I was wondering if you see any high school programs in any of your conversations or not yet.
I wish. I know of Bay Area schools that are doing that, and there are various grants that are available. I think there's a growing awareness, especially since COVID, of the benefits of spending time in nature. UCSF, for example, has some recent studies showing the benefits of public open spaces and green spaces for health, and it measures mental, emotional well-being, physical well-being. So the more science, research, medical studies we have that are putting data behind the benefits of this, I think the more funding is going to be available for programs like that. Because oftentimes, one of the biggest barriers to access to nature is like the transportation and how do you get transportation. So I think in that way, I am very optimistic.
Me too. Me too.
Yeah. Well, and I think, if you can have those routine daily interactions with nature, right, that's going to help us. Tell me from this article, like what sort of came out of it? It obviously had a lot of legs. But like, who has like approached you? Tell me a little bit like the feedback you've been getting, anything surprised you about its response?
Yeah, the level of interest is really exciting. How many different publications syndicated, how many different publications picked it up. That was really amazing. Cool. And especially like this was an international study. The main researcher was based out of Japan, but there are other collaborators on it. And just seeing the interest from all over the world about biophobia, which I had never heard of that term before writing this article. Yeah, I think it really clicks for a lot of people and it makes a lot of sense. It's like the missing piece of this story. And it was funny when I was talking to the researcher and he's like, yeah, a lot of ecologists, they study ecology because they love nature. And so they're not studying the fear of nature. Well, yeah, same thing for me. I've focused so much on the really beautiful, wonderful things that I love about nature. But really what's needed to bring more people into the biophilic mindset is addressing this fear of nature, is addressing what makes people feel like maybe they're not a nature person.
Right.
Air quotes.
Well, in your podcast, I'll Go If You Go, I think is fabulous. And is it associated with the Save the Redwoods League or is it separate? I wasn't sure.
Thank you. Yeah, it is part of their outreach.
Fantastic.
Well, and I think, Jen, what you do with your walks, right? The walks with Walsh, like, again, it's like you kind of need a peer or a guide, a mentor, a friend to take you outside if you do have any hesitation about it or you don't know how to get it, or to your point, I don't have the right gear. You know, it's like flip-flops in your whatever, sweatpants, like just walk down the street, you know. And it's like we had another amazing woman on, Hannah Palmer, who talked about creeks. Like, find your creek. It's amazing. She adopted like a creek that was like at the Atlanta airport of all places. Now, it wasn't in great shape maybe, but she's doing a whole cleanup of it. So it's like, we don't even know where these little creeks, like Jen, I think you had sent me another article that New York had all these creeks that are sort of like undiscovered. It's sort of like find your tree, find your little nook, find your creek.
That's the best part, right? Because so nature, biophilia, is that like our innate connection to all living things. And so here we are, like this discovery and this awareness and these like awe moments of, I didn't know, like Hannah Palmer did teach me that, because I got all these books in on like the streams under New York City because I was so shocked by it. And again, these like lessons learned that I'm discovering myself. So that nature's opening these continuous books of learnings of like, oh, how do I then protect it? How do I share this knowledge? How do I share this information so more people know, oh, why is New York City flooding so much? Well, of course, the systems are terrible in terms of like there's so much age going on, but we built these cities on top of streams and water will go where water once was, as Hannah taught us. So, but yes, that's exactly so true. So I think like you just said, like Monica and Emily is like this, nature sets up this discovery and awareness. And if we just keep ourselves more childlike to be in that sense of like wonderment all the time, it's like, oh, what's under this rock? What am I going to discover here? It's just always so interesting because that beauty is so profound once we sit in it and once we, realize it, and it can really change us. It changes our biology. It changes our minds. It opens our hearts. And I think that's the most beautiful part.
Yeah, definitely. I love the way you both put that. For me, when I learn new facts about nature, it's like painting in the characters of my story. Because one of the things that makes humans is our love for stories. And so if I can learn the names of the plants and animals, and maybe I'm learning to identify some rocks here and there, then I'm able to not just like take a walk down the street, but take a walk through the story of all the
I love that.
How is it going to be connected? And it just makes life so much richer. And so when I go out on a hike and I see a bird and I say, oh, that's a black phoebe. I know that, they're flitting around like looking for bugs, and then they're going to land on that tree. And just like being able to know how all of these different characters relate and interact. It's so much fun.
And then I'm beautiful. Yeah, that's right. You're part of that whole story. That's a beautiful way of saying that and looking at that. You're right, because we often just kind of go about our own business. And again, like that's us just putting up our, whatever. And that's also encourages biophobia because we don't even care. But I love that you said like we're all part of these stories that are unfolding all around us all the time. And the more you pay attention, the more you understand why that bird is so important to that environment and who's feeding on whom for whatever reason. It's a really fascinating unraveling, I guess, if you will.
It develops your attention in a different way. In this biophobia article, one of the researchers I talked to, Linda Powers-Tomaso, she researches human-nature interactions at Harvard. One of the benefits of nature she mentioned is that it helps us regain or develop our attention, our ability to focus, and exercise it in different ways than when we're using technology, which is, so fast, so many things going on. But when you're in nature, like a deeper kind of attention. Oh, here's a fun fact I learned once. The human eye is able to differentiate more shades of green than any other color. And the reason why is it's an evolutionary thing, because there's so much green in nature, and like maybe there is a snake in the tree that you don't want to walk into. I love snakes, by the way. But don't want to walk into one in my face. But yeah, like knowing little things like that makes me pay more attention to the, if I walk down the street and I see a tree, it's like, oh, well, how many shades of green can I notice on these leaves?
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like stuff like that is so cool.
So that's so neat. Emily, that excites me because that's where the wisdom is. Like you just said, like the technology, we have it and it's great and we're able to do this. So there's so much information and data, but wisdom is where we find that understanding of these places that just unearth this newness within us to witness. It's so cool because we're learning all the time when that wisdom is in us because there's an emotion attached to that movement and that feeling and that experience that you'll keep with you forever, which is really profound.
That's one of the reasons why I love studying chemistry is just to know like more on a deeper level, what is going on here. But in science, if you go deep enough, like talking about theoretical physics, for example, it's like you read the stuff and it's like, it feels like magic and spells. And in a way it is because we're just people in this world trying to make sense of things. I love learning. I think it's all magical.
Well, and I think that curiosity and wonder, again, goes back to how do you inspire people through that, right? Through your storytelling, through getting people out in nature. I think it is so important. And I know that the next article that you wrote, although it's not about biophobia, but I feel like it's a bit of a follow-up where I think the title was Humans' Fondness for the Odd and Rare Make Us Particularly Overwhelming Predators. And before we get into the predator part of it, I wonder, do people who, you could say they're collectors, right? And so we might collect shells on the beach there's no live animal in it, or a butterfly that is dead, but a lot of collectors collect more than that. And so I wonder if we were able to educate more people, the value of the live animal and what the detriment to what happens when we hunt down, kill, collect all of these species. So tell us a little bit about that article.
Yeah, that's something they came to me with this study. It's along the themes of human-nature interactions, which I really love to write about.
Yeah.
So with this study, the study found that humans take, kill, collect, capture more species of animals than any other predator on Earth. And I'm putting predator in here. The most surprising thing to both the researchers and to me about this study is that the number one use for these animals wasn't for food, but for pets, like for the pet trade. And I have to think that the reason why people are collecting these wild animals to keep as pets is because they don't understand, number one, that these animals are living beings that have whole lives, just like, not like humans, but in the same way that humans have lives in our societies, these animals have lives in their communities, even if they're a solitary animal that doesn't live in a pack. They're still in their ecological community. I had an interesting side conversation with a researcher about this study where I asked him if he thinks, I've scrolling Instagram. I've seen a lot of people, especially in places like Florida with more lax regulations about the wildlife trade. I've seen a lot of people posting videos, here's my chimpanzee scrolling on an iPhone. How funny. Or here I am hugging my liger. So I've seen a lot of these videos promoting keeping wild animals as pets and yeah, they're cute and they're fun and they're cool, but it's really just bad. In addition to these animals, having a poor quality of life in the human world versus in the natural environments, some of these animals are taken from the wild and these are endangered species. And that's a whole nother conversation is the wildlife trade. But yeah, I asked the researcher if he thinks social media plays a role in this. So the researcher thought that it was a really interesting idea. And yeah, probably. And then especially if you're going on social media to say, here's my tiger. Look how manly.
Yeah.
Right.
Damn.
Well, and that's it, right? I think thinking about why. Why do we feel the need to have these? And is it this, I don't know if this is the right word, showing off, or it's a very hierarchical, look at this cool thing I have, right? And so when people are moving from status symbols in, let's just say, fashion or automobiles is there this, well, and I won't even say there is, and obviously hunting and trophy hunting is, personally is disgusting. I just think that's horrific. But that quote, trophy hunting doesn't always just mean a head on your wall. It could be, to your point, an endangered species that they're keeping live, and really trying to educate people about how can we steward these animals rather than prey on them, right? And I'm speaking specifically about keeping them rather than killing them. And I think one of the interesting things that you noted, I believe, was, that some of these birds that had been captured, and I'm not sure which ones, like, you're actually, when you're pulling them out of the ecosystem, what they do, because I think they were being stolen for their big beaks, their big beaks cracked open these nuts, and sort of like the largest and hardest nuts to crack in the forest because of the strength of their beaks. And what that did is it got seed dispersal, right? So it spread trees around the forest. And so when somebody's taking that bird out of the wild for its, whatever beak or the look of it for, let's just call it status, they're not only harming the animal, they're harming the ecosystem. So it all goes back to the really big thing of, like, if we're disconnected, we have no sense. Like, and we don't even think we think of it as a thing to be captured rather than another animal, a living system, a biophilic part of our system. I like that a lot. I know, Jen, you really jumped on that too. It's like, God, if we could think of the animals and the trees and the birds all as, even the mosquitoes, as characters in this ecosystem, maybe we can sort of, this is not the right word, maybe humanize them, but what is the right word for that? Like, where we're really understanding that they have their own existence and they have a place in the world, and their place might be to crack open nuts and disperse seeds to better a forest.
I think it's really interesting that you pause on the word humanize, because throughout the history of modern Western science, we're told you don't want to humanize nature. You don't want to humanize an animal, but personify them. And while there are merits to that, of course, you don't want to assume the intentions of another being. Even another person, how much can you assume the person's interior mind? I think it's that separation of humans versus other creatures that has been so detrimental to our ability to have compassion for and appreciate other living things as, like, beings, like people. At the end of this Humans Are Predators article, it's what I think is the most important part of the piece, where I talked to Andrea Reed. She's an Indigenous fisheries scientist at the University of British Columbia. And so she opposed the categorization of people as predators. And she said, like, for a lot of cultures, humans aren't predators, we're stewards of the environment. And to even separate out predators versus prey, you're creating this hierarchy in a way where predators are at the top. And instead of thinking of people as predators, and instead of thinking of people as, the top of the food chain, what if we say, well, no, humans, what can we be in nature? We can be stewards. We can give back. We can take care of things. And what if that's our role? We can still hunt animals. So maybe hunter is a better word than predator. Like, even calling animals predator, like a bear, for example, I think a lot of people would call a predator. But what do bears do? They eat berries, and they're not only carnivores, but something really important they do in the ecosystem, when they go to the river and they fish the salmon, they go back into the forest, they poop it out. It helps to fertilize the forest. So if you go out and you kill a bear, you're removing that fertilizer that helps to nourish these really lush forests. Similarly to what you mentioned, Monica, the helmeted hornbill, that one bird. So every animal contributes, including people. We can be stewards too.
Yeah. And I think the idea, and I feel like, Jen, you and I had this conversation offline a week or so ago, of this sort of thought process of living hierarchically versus living more, place-based, or of a place or of a space. Because if it's hierarchical, then it is predator versus prey. And it's very aggressive, and it's very us against them or me against you. And it's like, that's not a great way to live. And so how can we think about living more within a place, right? With all of these people, this community of animals and people and trees and plants.
And yes, some things get eaten and some don't. So you do need and we'll use the word, continue to use the word predator. You do need the ecosystem to hopefully work itself out.
That's exactly it, right? We're going to live more eco-friendly versus ego. So it's like we're looking through the lens of the ecosystem versus the ego system, because everyone's usually going from the lens of ego. It's all about me, my wants, my needs, my. So the eco, which is the we, and all species are connected. And that's that holistic thing that you're talking about. It's really so important to kind of look outside of ourselves for the greater being of all.
Yes. Yes to all of that. And I love that point of being connected to place. I think it's so important. And it's just like taking a step back to look at how we fit into the landscape. One of the most beautiful things to me is if I'm able to go out and go on a hike. And, I live in San Francisco. One of the reasons that I wanted to be here is all the beautiful nature. So, I can go walk out into the neighborhood and I can see a red-tailed hawk flying over the ocean. And it's just one of the most beautiful things to see an animal just sow itself in the landscape. And they just, like, to me, I witness this and I feel like, wow, that is so perfect. And sometimes when I'm not in nature and I forget myself, maybe it's not forgetting myself. Maybe it's remembering myself, remembering my animal body, that I'm an animal too. And just like feeling that aliveness, it's just one of the best feelings to me.
That's so beautiful, Emily. I love that so much.
So as we wrap up, because that's a beautiful way to sort of like put an exclamation point on this. What's next? How can we follow you? What should we be looking for? We obviously we'll put a link for the podcast in our show notes. What's Emily up to?
Oh, well, thanks for asking. A whole lot of things. In my immediate future, I'm going to Jackson Wild Summit in Wyoming next week. I'm one of this year's Media Lab fellows, so it's going to be an intensive filmmaking workshop. I'm super excited. I'm a writer. I love writing. One of the things I love most is telling the stories. And so this is just going to be the next chapter of my storytelling is, incorporating that because it's just a whole nother medium to explore. So yeah, be on the lookout for my film.
That's wonderful. So are you also on Instagram or LinkedIn? Where else can we follow your adventures?
Yeah, I'm on Instagram at EM_Witz, WITZ. I've been on and off posting. I've been taking a little social media break recently.
Good for you.
But I also have a website, emilyharwitz.com, which I plan to update soon. And I'm also going to be starting a newsletter just where I can put my recent thoughts, things I've been thinking about, learning about, books and other media I recommend. Yeah. So if you're curious to see what I'm thinking about, I guess I better put that link on my website now. Where you can
We'll add them all to the show notes. And gosh, it's so good to see you again. And thank you for your time and joining us. I mean, it's been a pleasure. And I can't wait to read your next piece. And I'm dying to hear after you got to let us know how the summit goes in Jackson.
We're going to be waiting with bated breath.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much, Monica and Jen. This was really wonderful to talk with you both and to see you again after the amazing Biophilic Summit. That's really.
I know we're going to find our way out to San Francisco, Jen, right?
We are.
Yes, come visit. Let's take a walk with Jen.
I love that.
All right.
I have the book on my shelf.
Oh, wonderful. Oh, I'm so happy to hear that. Thank you.
So I think biophobia is a really fascinating phenomenon. I mentioned this in the interview, but I met so many people who say things like, oh, I'm not outdoorsy all the time, and just totally disregard the entire outside world.
Yeah. And to Emily's point, connecting with nature can look different for so many people and in so many ways. And so I love that her podcast deals with all the different ways people can get out and make a genuine connection with it. And you don't need to be decked out head to toe in gear from REI or Patagonia and start free soloing off the mountains or anything. I mean, we've talked about that before, right? Like,
you
just need to get outside.
Oh my God, exactly, Monica. Like, I love a quiet hike in nature, but I also love gathering around the fire with my friends. And if camping isn't your thing, try glamping.
Exactly. And for one person to say, oh, it's not my thing, it feels pretty benign. And in most cases, it is benign, like they just haven't had that connection. But when you have lots and lots of people completely forgetting that humans are part of nature, now this is where that cycle of phobia begins.
Yes. And like we talked about, that can culminate in so many really bad things like bad climate policies as well.
Yeah. And quickly, I should point out that a certain level of biophobia is healthy, right? If you're up in the mountains, be aware of bears. If you're in a densely wooded or grassy area, be aware of snakes and ticks. But maybe, we shouldn't call it biophobia. Maybe it's just like smart spatial or nature awareness.
Gosh, it's so true. And I love that you just said that. And this awareness of the wider ecosystem too. I think when you understand that every living thing you find out in nature has an important role to play, it becomes harder to disconnect from it, or at least harder to fear it, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. And, we've got lots of links that we put in the show notes for anyone who would like to dive further into Emily's work.
Yeah, it's really great. And I guess we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
That's right. Bye, Jen.
Bye, Monica.
Thanks so much for listening. And if you're enjoying the podcast, we would love for you to follow us on your favorite podcast app, give us a 5-star rating, and please leave us a review.
It really goes such a long way towards helping us reach a wider audience and sharing these amazing interviews and solutions with the world.
Absolutely. So thanks so much for following and reviewing the podcast, and we'll be back with another amazing interview in 2 weeks. You're now a part of the Biophilic movement.